Hello, everybody. I'm really glad to be invited to speak today. I just want to share a little bit about myself. I'm with EPA's Energy Star program, and I am the Energy Star National Manager for the public sector work to help states and local governments develop benchmarking policies and building performance standards, and then implement those using our tools and resources. I've actually been with EPA for more than 20 years and working with Energy Star all that time. Supporting our tool called Portfolio Manager, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. Barry really put together a great set of speakers, and I'll go ahead and say from the very get-go that if any of you in the audience with jurisdictions are thinking about getting into the arena of benchmarking and building performance standards for your jurisdiction, the lineup of speakers today are the right people to go to ask for follow-up information, so including myself. Hold on one second. It looks like my slide is not advancing. My goodness. I apologize. I think that remote control. I think it's due to the fact that I have multiple screens. I do apologize. I'm going to just give me 1 second and I'm going to just change my settings so I only have one screen. But unfortunately, I'll have to stop sharing. Maybe, Barry, if there's any questions in the chat, you can ask people about for a sec while I do this. Be great.
Sure. Yeah, no worries, Katie.
One question that there was asked in the chat, I can just speak to about COVID. 8 of the 11 building performance standards that have been adopted since March 2020. So in the COVID era, and they are making allowances. We recognize that with work remotely, it is creating greater vacancy in offices, and there need to be arrangements made, but also we recognize that ventilation in buildings is more important than ever, and so jurisdictions are now looking at requiring minimum ventilation, like measuring CO2 levels as part of building performance standards.
And do you have any data on typical FTE investment on the city side per scale of buildings for a BPS?
For BPS broadly, or was it, I missed a couple words in what you said?
Sorry, how does the number of city staff required scale up with the number of buildings or the floor area of buildings regulated? Do you have a context for that?
I can say that it's much more in proportion to the number of buildings than the square footage of buildings. So that leads jurisdictions to want to focus on larger buildings because it's going to be a similar level of effort for a large building as a small building. And of course, large buildings use much more energy, impact much more people. In terms of resources, we do have some resources on our website. Generally, jurisdictions are looking at having at least a couple FTEs to implement their building performance standards, and it may take a little bit more upfront as you're getting stuff set up, you're doing rulemaking, you're setting standards and that sort of thing. The EPA and DOE both have resources that can be very helpful, especially for things like setting the actual numeric standards. And of course, the standards have to be different for each building type. A hospital is going to use a lot more energy than a unrefrigerated warehouse, for instance. So, you know, the folks at LBNL and DOE have done a lot of work in terms of helping jurisdictions use benchmarking and other data to set those levels.
You're looking promising, Katie?
It was. You guys saw it move, right? But now it's not again. I don't know. This has never happened to me actually in Zoom before. I do not know what's going on.
You. I can help you. So what? I'll just share my screen.
Yeah, that'd be great.
You can just tell me when to advance. So
okay.
Just, please, if anybody has epilepsy, close your eyes for a minute because I'm going to have to advance through all of Travis's slides. Right.
Okay. Great. Next slide. All right, great. Sorry about that, everybody. So I'm glad to be here today to tell you about some EPA tools and resources here. What we have provided for all of you through our Energy Star program is a toolkit that focuses on benchmarking building performance standards. And within that, there's dedicated chapters to benchmarking and building performance standards. And then because we feel like there's greater need out there in the marketplace and for policymakers to understand the metrics that can be used to measure the performance and whether normalization is an issue or not, we've created additional guidance that has to do with recommended metrics and normalization methods. So what you can do is access those yourself online, or you can contact me and we can talk about them and answer all your questions. And then in addition, next slide, please. I'd like to just share with you some detailed information about Portfolio Manager. And sure, I can turn on my camera. So basically, Portfolio Manager has been in existence since, like 1996. And so there's more than 270,000 buildings that are benchmarking in Portfolio Manager nationwide. And it's the tool that's used by California for supporting the benchmarking mandate AB 802, which has been in existence for a number of years. I'm the lead contact working with CEC from on the implementation of AB 802. I'm also the lead contact for the Energy Star program, working with all the local governments that have benchmarking and building performance standards in the state of California. And so for those of you that don't know that Portfolio Manager does more than benchmark energy use. It's also used to track water use. It does calculate greenhouse gas emissions associated with the energy consumption. It's also the pathway to get an Energy Star score on our 1 to 100 scale that measures a building's energy performance as compared to other similar buildings nationwide, and how you apply for Energy Star certification. Just to pass on the information that if a building does earn the Energy Star, it means it also meets ASHRAE standards for ventilation and thermal comfort, which is important to some basics associated with indoor environmental quality. You can also in the tool track information about your renewable energy consumption and green power purchases. So CEC through AB 802 collects a lot of benchmarking data through Portfolio Manager that then is disclosed on California's benchmarking website through Tableau. They're bringing out a lot of data that allows you to filter and understand what's happening with building energy consumption and emissions by space type in your own area. And so understanding current performance is incredibly important to thinking through what you might want to do with a building performance standard. Now, AB 802 is focused on properties that are over 50,000 square feet. And so what I would say is that you can still learn something from buildings in your jurisdiction that are over that size. However, some of the local governments that are implementing their own benchmarking ordinance, what they've done is they've lowered the threshold to be a lower square footage threshold, which then gives them data to understand the performance of buildings that are under that 50,000 square foot threshold. And go to the next slide, please. So the output of Portfolio Manager is these metrics here and many, many more. In order to get accurate metrics to provide information about building performance, it's really important to understand that the data going into Portfolio Manager was entered correctly. As part of the California benchmarking requirement, utilities are required by law to provide automated data into Portfolio Manager for building owners. And so we are actually working with the utilities across the state to try to help ensure that that data accuracy improves in terms of the processes and practices that those utilities are using to send the data in. I'd like to stop and share that when we started this benchmarking initiative, more than a decade ago, with the leaders out there across the country that are decided on their own, not because EPA required them to, jurisdictions on their own decided to mandate the use of portfolio manager to understand building performance better. So there would be increased transparency and that information could be given to building owners. So one thing that's important about that is that that benchmarking, this benchmarking exercise, what it does is brings together the energy consumption information for all the fuels consumed, including the renewables used on site, combines that with square footage information to then produce the energy use intensity data that can be used to track performance over time and relative to other similar buildings, whether it's within a jurisdiction, within a climate zone, or across the nation. And so it takes data and turns it into informative information to then make investment decisions. Same with metrics like direct greenhouse gas emissions intensity. So direct greenhouse gas emissions intensity would be emissions that's combusted on site, and technology decisions and investment decisions are more in control of a building owner for that type of emissions. That the building owners don't really have control over what's happening with the emissions on the grid. So indirect emissions, they have little control over. So in terms of recommended metrics, many years, fast forward to now with many years of experience on the EPA side, we've come about to recommend that for building performance standard purposes for existing buildings, that it's important to focus on site energy use intensity and direct greenhouse gas emissions use intensity. And then it's also important to understand the Energy Star score, because that allows you to understand in a normalized manner for the eligible property types how that building compares to their peers. As Cliff mentioned earlier, the reason why we're wanting to combine site energy use intensity with direct emissions intensity as a metric is to help ensure that as buildings work toward efficient decarbonization, you do understand the building's energy efficiency, and you also understand its emissions picture, so you don't have no carbon buildings that are actually energy inefficient. And so since efficiency does really matter. But back to the story about data and data accuracy and why it's important for local governments to think about is that broader statewide initiatives like what California is doing with AB 802, it's really important to work together across the different levels of government to help the building owners end up with the most accurate data as possible that's then verified. So then you can understand that it's good data to then base decisions on for things like informing building performance standard targets, measuring compliance for those individual properties and so forth. So if you think about it this way, part of the reason to benchmark is simply to understand all the energy consumed on a property. So if you have a building that's got many tenants and all of a sudden you're missing a couple of tenants' meters, then you have incomplete data. So working through privacy concerns and so forth, EPA has been working with utilities and other stakeholders to help get aggregated whole building energy use data to building owners that have multiple tenants. And so they can then understand their whole building energy performance in a meaningful way to then inform investment decisions. At the end of the day, you can't manage what you don't measure. And in order to manage it, what you're measuring needs to be accurate. And so putting in a plug for thinking through data accuracy and verification, and the local governments in the audience today can work together with CEC in terms of helping basically increase the compliance and improve accuracy related to AB 802 data, and then that data will become even more useful for informing local initiatives. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the main resources that we have is our benchmarking and building performance standards toolkit. And there is this whole section on benchmarking and transparency and a whole section on building performance standards. And then also there's a section that's about state and local government coordination. And to not repeat what I was just saying and to dive into an additional reason why states and local governments want to coordinate. And so for all of you, it would be great if you coordinated with CEC. So you have at the local level a better idea of what buildings are in your jurisdictions in terms of the buildings that are over a certain square footage and would potentially need to comply to an ordinance. And so collaborating with CEC to try to help them implement AB 802 would be great. And then it would also inform your intent, if you have one, to have your own benchmarking and building performance standard program. Next slide, please. So the type of technical assistance that we offer through EPA's Energy Star program is basically advisory support in terms of your program development and policy design, and then implementation support. So Portfolio Manager is the tool that's used to bring in the energy data from all the fuels that are consumed by a property, combine it again with the square footage and a little bit of other operating characteristic information, and then produce the output metrics that are used for compliance. Now, Portfolio Manager is the tool that is used for benchmarking. There's other tools that you're going to hear about from Paul Matthews, who's speaking after me from the Department of Energy, that that work interactively with Portfolio Manager's data to help with beyond benchmarking and also understanding more about building performance standard policy implementation. So we have a policymaker network that all of you can join, and then that runs quarterly. And then we also use that network to share information about new tools and resources that you would need to know about along the way. And then the good news is that we're working very collaboratively with Department of Energy, as well as other key influencing organizations such as IMT and others that you've heard from today. And so we tend to be linking to each other's resources well enough that if you look at one of our resources, it's hopeful that you will then get to the other resources that you need. So next slide, please. And then coming down the pike soon, we're producing additional guidance on metrics and target selection, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. And then we're also developing an Energy Star Next Generation recognition that's focusing on encouraging electrification and carbon reductions. And then, as I mentioned, data accuracy and verification is incredibly important. And so we're working on some sample policy language for that. So if you are considering passage of a policy, please circle back with me so I can give you our latest sample policy language for this and some other areas that are important. Next slide. Okay, so that's it. And to reach me, you can either of these routes work. Thank you very much.